Hello, welcome to our Bible class this morning. I'm glad you were able to join me as we continue our study in 1 Peter. And today we're in 1 Peter chapter 4, the first 6 verses. So if you'd like to turn there, you can, or if you'd like to just follow along with the screen, that's be fine too. But it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Have you ever felt uncomfortably different? Now perhaps you arrived somewhere on the wrong night. Or maybe you thought you were going to a costume party, but no one else knew that word, and you came dressed differently than they did. That's a tough feeling, knowing that others look at you as strange and out of place. It happened to our family once. I remember that we had children elementary age, and we took a staycation and while we lived in the Houston area, and we found a pretty good deal in a fairly nice hotel closer to where we wanted to be, so we didn't have to drive an hour or so every time we wanted to go do something. And what was close to there were things like theme parks and the zoo and various other things that I knew my children would enjoy, and we would as well. So we checked into this hotel, and one of the days we took off in our shorts and our t-shirts, and we went to the zoo, I remember. When we came back, we were hot. We'd spent a day in the muggy, warm climate of Houston. We were sweaty, we were dirty, and I'm sure we didn't smell very good either. And so we all got out of the car, and the only thing I could think of was getting cleaned up and relaxing a little bit. So we went to the garage, and the garage adjoined to the hotel through a hallway. We opened the door, prepared to go to the elevator, to go to our room, when it happened. Suddenly, we had emptied ourselves into a hallway that was bordered by ballrooms. And the ballrooms were full that night, with some sort of a gala that required men to wear tuxedos and women to wear evening gowns, many of which cost more than I made in a year, you could tell. They were dripping with jewelry. And as this bedraggled group of 4 came in, sweaty, dirty, and smelly, we had to walk that whole hallway while eyes locked in on us with the question, "What are you doing here?" It wasn't very comfortable running that gauntlet. And I'm sure that I don't know what they were thinking, but the gazes, at least, felt judgmental. Now, Peter knows that feeling. He's described Christians as sojourners who live in a strange world, as strangers. We stick out because of what we believe, and we're distinctively different because of our values and the behavior that flows out of those values. But to do well in that situation, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We have not to fit in. We have to not fit in when everyone fits in. So Peter approaches this idea of living as strangers as to what our lifestyle should look like, beginning in this lesson. And in this lesson, he presents us with 3 different perspectives. We need to be comfortably uncomfortable in our Christian lives. Peter starts chapter 4 by reminding us of an anchoring idea for the Christian life, one he's brought up before, because we face nothing more than what Christ himself faced. He has gone first, and now we simply follow. When you listen to what he says, "Since therefore Christ has suffered in the flesh," he starts with that word, therefore. It's a term that's based on what we've already learned. Because of what you now know, here's what you do with that. That's what the therefore focuses on. And it focuses on Christ's suffering. Now, why is that essential for this discussion? Beyond the theological fact of the atonement, left us an example. It is a practical benefit. And it puts a stake in the ground that he put in chapter 2. For this reason, you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you might follow in his steps. We have Christ doing what we have to do at the same time. Jesus provided a paradigm of what we will face. He has gone before, and we paint our lives into the stencil that he's left behind. In chapter 2, his suffering demonstrated how we respond to threats. Here, Christ's suffering is an armory passing out a potent weapon. Listen to what Peter has to say. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with this same way of thinking. Now that's a term, a military term, to arm yourself. Before he went into a battle, a Roman soldier would select his weapons, the things which he would meet the pitched battle with. I always wonder when I read these passages if Peter didn't have a particular affinity for that metaphor. When you read the stories of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, it is the Apostle John in his gospel who names Peter as the culprit of Gethsemane. When Judas plants the kiss on Jesus, signaling as the man to be seized, Peter has enough. It's time to spring into action, so he pulls out a sword and he starts flailing wildly and he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus rebukes him. You don't bring a sword to a sacrifice. So he must wince a little when he uses that word. But it's a different kind of weapon. The term arm yourself gets sprinkled through the New Testament quite often. It is a regular metaphor for various things because the battle between good and evil has to have weapons, and we have weapons. And Paul uses that same language to remind us of the nature of the weapon. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. The weapons we employ are not flashing scimitars or iron battle swords of the Roman soldier. They are spiritual weapons to handle a spiritual problem. So what weapon does Peter have in mind? Listen to what he says. Since therefore Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking. We are to employ the same thinking and mindset that Jesus had. He saw his life and his task differently. Jesus trusted God to deliver him. Because of that, he never changed what he did, and he never changed what he said, and it didn't alter the way he approached suffering. That is the thinking that we need to use when you go into the spiritual battle of being distinct from the world. Now the question is, can you think that way? Now Peter would have never instructed us to do something that was beyond our capacity. He does say we have to maintain this heavenly perspective. And that may be the difficult part, but it is doable. It is achievable. Now, what value is it for us to arm ourselves with this thinking that Jesus had when it came to living in this world? Well, he continues this in verse 1. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Peter says that it proves we have ceased from sin. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we have stopped sinning altogether because we still have human flesh. But it does indicate that we change our ideas concerning sin and we stop the habitual sinning over and over and over again. And you see, Paul has captured the same idea, but he uses a little bit more familiarly. For one who has died has been set free from sin. The same word. When we cease to sin, we stop giving into it. We stop enjoying more of it. Sin stops becoming a pattern in our lives. And there's something inherent in the idea of ceasing from sin. It provides us the stamina to resist even more sin and even more temptation. The Hebrew writer captured that in Hebrews chapter 12. For the moment, all discipline, read suffering there, seems painful rather than pleasant. But later, it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. This trains us to grow stronger. And just as the weightlifter stresses muscles to make them grow, resistance to sin makes temptation easier to refuse. Now, Christians can live in the pressure of the moment because they have had a trailblazer who shows them how, and we know the value that brings. So we can meet the challenge of suffering because we have indeed been changed. The New Testament presents a paradox. We live in fleshly bodies, but we live for a spirit. As baptism displays we die and are buried in water and raised to the newness of life, and yet, even after that moment, we continue to live in the flesh. But we live for a different reason. We live for God. That's where Peter puts his stake in the ground and says, we are not the same. Verse 2 goes on to say there are two opposite ways of life. He said, as to live for the rest of time in the flesh no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Now we can act like the dogs of the researcher Pavlov, who conditioned them to salivate by ringing a bell. The flesh, when unchecked, answers every lustful thought and emotion, and it becomes a voracious animal seeking carnal meat. But instead, Peter contrasts that with the will of God. And as Peter uses the phrase, it becomes a rule of life. In short, Peter makes a bright line rule. Now, people have bright lines in their lives. An alcoholic who enters sobriety knows that no small amount of alcohol is going to be helpful. It will be deadly. It will cause him to tip back to where he was. So he has a bright line rule. No alcohol. It's what happened to Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton is a rock guitarist. He knows what a bright line rule is. After years of drinking and alcoholism, when he found himself in a stupor in ditches outside of bars in England, he looked at his life and he said, I got to stop this. So he stopped drinking and he started attending 3 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings a day, every day, wherever he is in the world. However, the day came when his 4-year-old son, Connor, fell from a 53rd floor apartment to his death. Clapton said if there was ever a day in which no one would have blamed him if he drank, he still refused. He had the rule in his life. Ours is to simply do the will of God. There is no compromise. We don't do the will of God sometimes, or when it's easy, or when it's convenient, or when our Christian friends are around. We do the will of God all the time. So Peter reminds them of this sharp and decisive change. For the time that is past suffices for doing these things. Peter says they have spent more than enough of their lives living like all these other people have. That's what the word suffices mean. They spent more than enough. Their lifestyles were now different from their Gentile counterparts, perhaps their former friends, perhaps the people they work with. What did their life look like? For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. Living sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. It's a sordid picture that Peter paints. He dabs his brush in the darkest black he can find. He begins to paint the brushstrokes of what human existence can fall to. It was, first of all, unrestrained and knew no boundaries of decency. I think the phrase, if it feels good, do it, probably fits this quite well. From theft to the worst kind of immorality, the word captures all kinds of evil that has no rein on it. They lived in a drunken stupor. Now the word lets you listen, because what it means is the wine bubbling in the glass. Gentiles spent so much time drinking that the sound of the bubbles was just their experience. Where men and women intermingled their lives, and that was a very commonplace element in society. Roving bands of drunk men stumbled through the streets, creating bedlam. Now today that still happens, but perhaps without so much alcohol. There's a current fad today on the social media platform TikTok, which appeals a lot to teenagers, in fact, that encourages students to vandalize their school restrooms and take pictures. Now, you can hear the faint echoes of the Roman world as cell phones post the damage. The idolatry was lawless. Idol worship was not a simple act of bowing before a marble bust or a statue. It became a lifestyle. In Ephesus, the worship of Diana included the stipulation of immorality with either hired men or women, or both, to satisfy the religious rites of Diana. At Dionysian temples, wine flowed freely and senses emptied of reason. I find it interesting that when men make gods, they make them in their image to give them permission to do all the things they want to do that morality won't let them do. That's idolatry. But the Christian's change of life was dramatic. It was night and day. The language says you come to the end of a book and you close it, never to open it again, never to see it again. We need moments where we say, I'll never go back. A few years ago, my daughter tried to get me to buy lace-up shoes, and I refused. And it was for a reason. I have worn slip-on shoes all of my life, at least from a certain point. The reason I gave her, she didn't understand it until I told her. When I was 12 years old, I had a condition due to growth plates moving differently, in which I had to wear orthopedic shoes. Now, all kids at that age, 12 to 15, they just want to fit in. They want to look like each other. They don't want to stand out in any way. That's one of the hallmarks of early adolescence. They want to appear just like their friends. Problem is, at least in my own mind, my shoes made me feel like I stood out. They were clunky. They weren't stylish. They were laced up. There came a day when I got out of orthopedic shoes. On that day, I told myself, I will never go back. To this day, I wear slip-on or loafers. I will never go back. Now, the Christian could say that about their previous life. I will never go back. But that creates tension with the culture around them, because pagans were not, and still are not, tolerant of people who are so different than themselves. There seems to be this need to level everyone to the same small, low level. a homogenization of society where we all think alike, act alike, believe alike. And that's why Peter goes on to say, with respect to this, meaning lifestyle, they are surprised. They are surprised. They are shocked. And Peter chooses a word that really described the entertainment of strangers. When somebody new would come to a door and said, I need someplace to stay, they've never seen anybody like that before, so they bring them in. It happened because the strangers were novel and new and different and strange. Because the strange gets attention. Sometimes unwanted attention. But for Christians, their novel lifestyle had another effect. See, Peter goes on to say, with respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. They want you to pour your life in the same swamp they bathe in. It is a picture of complete degradation. The prophet Jeremiah captured what this must have been like when the people of God rejected the covenant and began to go after their passions that were coupled with worshiping the Baals. How can you say, I am not unclean, I have not gone after the Baals? Look at your way in the valley. Know what you have done. A restless camel running here and there, a wild donkey used to the wilderness in her heat, sniffing the wind, who can restrain her lust? None who seek her need weary themselves. In her month they will find her. Jeremiah says it resembles animals. A camel seeking to satisfy urges circles the desert needlessly. Or the wild donkey in heat pursues the lust of satisfaction. The game for society, for culture, then and now, is to join them in satisfying our lusts. But Christians refuse to play. And that resulted in slander. The slander of the worst possible kind. Because if you cannot change someone, you just smear their good name. You bring them down so you can lift yourself up. It's a tragedy that people demean those who make them look foul when their own degradation comes to light. They say, well, I may be that bad, but I'm not as bad as. They want to bring the level down. And that's what Christians were experiencing. That's what we continue to experience. Good people who face slander by those who want us to be as corrupt as they are. Because Christians never fit in with the world. They speak with a spiritual accent and live with the different cultural standards. And our foreignness, our alienness, makes the world we live in angry and vindictive. Because we don't act like they do. We are immigrants from a foreign land who are persecuted for who we are. But Peter reminds them of a coming reality. There's a fundamental principle of life that no one escapes the consequences of life. Eventually, all books balance. And Peter gives us a glimpse into this future both ways. But they, the Gentiles, will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. There's going to be an accounting that's going to take place. And you get paid for the life you live. No one event is idle, for all will find judgment on that day. You can deny the reality that it will happen, and many do, but you can't avoid the reality when it happens. The problem, a life that means anything must be accounted for, because if we don't account for our lives, nothing we do means anything. It's empty, as Solomon would say in Ecclesiastes. But Peter goes on to say there's not going to be any excuses either. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. That though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit as God, in the way God does. Now Peter brings up that concept of the dead. And who are the dead? Now some want to run back to last week's lesson to where Jesus is preaching to the spirits in prison. And in this context, it probably fits better to see them as something else. Those who, while alive, have heard the message of Christ, but have since died unrepentant and unchanged. They ignore the very truth that was placed in front of their faces, and now they will face the consequence of their choices. While alive, we determine our direction. The world will judge us by its standards in the flesh. They expect us to live as they do. And if not, they pay us back in their kind. But instead, we choose to live in the Spirit. And instead of being like the Gentiles, whoever that may be in the scheme of things in our world, instead of living like the Gentiles around us, we choose to be like God, whom we serve. Because the future is determined by today's choices, how those choices show up in life. This lesson shines a light on typical worldly behavior we face every day. And those in our culture who live at the cultural level, they're shocked that Christians are so different. Perhaps that's because they meet so-called Christians who are not so different. So when they meet someone who really is, they think they're a fanatic, a religious nut. But living for the will of God, by definition, makes us a diamond against black velvet. Should we not shock the whole world? Should we not shock the wicked with our behavior? We do it. Then it proves that we don't belong here in this world because we're looking for tomorrow. We don't look for today. So when others say yes to fleshly ideas, we say no because we know tomorrow is coming. So we live for the day to prepare for the tomorrow. There's a simple reason that we do that. We don't belong here. When I was in 10th grade, I loved inner speech tournaments. That was one of the things I did, which is why I became what I became, I suppose. One took place at a neighboring high school. That's when I got a lesson in being different. I was a little early for my speaking slot, so I thought I would use the restroom. And I opened the door, and I was smacked in the face by a blue haze because the whole boys' restroom was filled with other boys a little older than I was, and they were all smoking. And I stood there, kind of in shock. You could see them beginning to chuckle at me, the naive rube that came into this. I knew I couldn't stay in there. And I remember this day, the thought I had as I left. I don't belong here. Perhaps that's the thought that crosses our mind at times. And God says, that's okay. You don't belong here. You belong to me. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our study together as I have. And I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you again next week. Have a great day.